Florida, just out of nowhere, dropping a bombshell on us. They're going to keep head coach Billy Napier for the foreseeable future. That is announced via a message from Scott Strickland, Florida's athletic director. So what do we make of all this? So we'll talk about it right now. First, I just want to touch on a couple of things that Scott Strickland touched on in this letter. I'll just read it to you. Quote, I wanted to let you know that Billy Napier will continue as head coach or head football coach of the Florida Gators. As we've seen these past several weeks, the young men on this team represent what it means to be a Gator. Their resolve, effort, and execution are evident in their performance and growth each week, building a foundation that promises great success next season and beyond. So that's just a part of the letter that he refers to and why they're keeping Billy Napier. But this is a lot. This is a lot because I think many of us, myself included, thought after that Texas A&M game, like, hey, that's probably all she wrote. That's probably going to be the end of the Billy Napier era because early on now there was some things that just quite frankly looked a little bit inexcusable, like to come out against Miami, against another coach that was hired the same time as you, and to look not just they get beat, they weren't competitive. Like it was bad. It was very, very bad. Then A&M, they're playing against a redshirt freshman quarterback at your place, and A&M runs through you. And so I think at that point in time, we're all like, okay, probably about time for this thing to be done. Now, as the season progressed, though, we saw Florida, to their credit, to Billy Napier's credit, do what Scott Strickland is speaking to in this letter. You saw them start to not just win football games, but look a lot more organized, look like a better operation overall. And so my gut on this is a couple of thoughts. One, I think the leadership void at the top of Florida administratively probably plays a factor here. I would also say I think if you're keeping Billy Napier, based on what that letter says, if I'm taking Scott Strickland at his word, they are keeping Billy Napier because they believe in a lot of things that, quite frankly, we just must not be seeing on the football field. Now, I understand it's great to beat UCF. It's great to beat Kentucky when they're down. I'm all for that. Great to look competitive against Georgia. But if it's me, I might have waited a little bit longer until the end of the season to get a good gauge for how this thing was potentially going to trend. Because it's great to fight for each other early on in the year. It's great to get up for a game against Georgia. But, like, who are you when you're playing towards the end of the season? And maybe, just maybe, Florida puts themselves in a position where maybe they have a tough loss on the road somewhere. Maybe it is a little bit of a hey, we're up against it. We took one more tough loss in November, and now we got to circle the wagons one more time. Curious to see how they respond. But again, I mean, more power to Florida, more power to Scott Strickland deciding to keep Billy Napier. Here's one more thing I would say though: if I'm Florida, you make this move to keep Billy Napier. You don't revisit this thing at the end of September and say, okay, we're going to punt on this. Like, I guess we shouldn't have kept him for another year. Because in that point, like, you're punting on 2 seasons, in my opinion. If you think Billy Napier is the guy, you give him the time to continue to build and solidify the foundation that you keep talking about and keep talking about in this letter in terms of the direction and the progress and all those things. To put it simply, be patient. And that was a big reason why I think a lot of us are surprised that Florida's making this move, because patient isn't necessarily a word that I would use to describe Florida and how they've operated in the past. I would also say, as a fan base, if you're Florida, like, we're talking right now about, can Florida make a bowl game? Can Florida get to 7 wins? Was the conversation going into the season. And so now for Florida, 7 wins in the next couple of years, it's not going to cut it. Like, that's not the standard at Florida. That's not what that logo expects, not what that fan base expects. And quite frankly, given their track record, given their history, I don't think you have to expect less than, winning the conference and national titles. Now, I would say this, though. I don't think you flip the switch next season and all of a sudden you're competing for the SEC. Like, next season, when it comes to expectations, if DJ Lagway is that guy and he ends up translating how I think a lot of us perceive he could translate to, then maybe Florida's an 8-9 win football team. But it's still the SEC. And keep in mind, too, we talk so much about the schedule, how tough it is for Florida, and oh my gosh, they got all these difficult games at the end of November. The schedule next year in the SEC, we're not shuffling the deck here and giving you new opponents. We just flip that thing on its head and say, okay, play that same SEC schedule, just go to their place if they came to your place and vice versa. So, like, the task ahead of Billy Napier here doesn't get a whole lot easier. And so that's why I say this again. If you're making this decision right now, this is for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part, or at least until the end of next season. Don't revisit this thing in September and say, oh man, that was fun. Thanks so much, Billy Napier. But now, because the buyout has decreased, we're going to go ahead and make a pivot here, and now you're fired. See this thing through to the end. Again, I think this is a decision made based on what Scott Strickland is saying, and based on, I think, if you're a Florida fan, how you would feel if you were in the camp of keeping Billy Napier. probably a foundational thing, things that are happening behind closed doors, and have to believe that DJ Lagway, whether it was a front of mind or back of mind decision, had to play in some way, shape, or form into this decision. Again, maybe it's a subconscious thing, but like, you got a generational talent at quarterback. It would seem if you were to fire Billy Napier, I'll say this too, you do hit reset on the roster. And we talked about that a little bit last week on our Sunday reaction show. Like, if you want to fire Billy Napier, understand you are rolling the dice here on hitting the reset on everything that you have built internally, regardless of what you think they've built internally, whether you think that's phenomenal, whether you think it's not good at all. Like, you would hit the reset because the portal does what the portal does, and you obviously do run the risk of losing a guy like a DJ Lagway, among others. So, a little bit surprising. I don't think many of us saw this coming, but regardless, Florida making their decision to stick with Billy Napier. And again, if it's me, I'm hoping now that it is a long-term decision, long-term meaning you stick with him for another season. Because again, if you were going to fire him in September, you're just punting on the season. And I'm not for that. I don't think Florida fans are for that either.